Hi, and welcome to the Brooklyn Rail's 975th New Social Environment. I'm Chloe, Director of Programs here at the Rail, and I have the pleasure of being your MC today for a conversation featuring artist Matt Phillips and artist and writer Jason Stopa. Matt Phillips's work often employs fundamental elements of painting, simple shapes, modulated values, and color relationships. These rather rudimentary components are combined and remixed to produce unexpected outcomes. Color, shape, mark, and form engage one another in both strange and familiar ways, becoming tense, humorous, quirky, and ultimately meaningful. He's represented by the Landon Gallery and Mindy Solomon Gallery. And our host today, Jason Stopa, is a painter and writer living in Brooklyn. He received his BFA from Indiana University Bloomington and his MFA from Pratt Institute. Recent solo shows include DIY Paradise at Assembly Houston, among others. Stopa is assistant professor of fine arts at FIT and contributing writer to the Brooklyn Rail, Bomb, Hyperallergic, Momus, Art Critical, and many other art journals. And with that, I'm going to pass it over to Jason.
Thank you, Chloe, and thank you to everybody here at the Rail and to Matt Phillips. I'm a little under the weather, but we're going to make it through this. I met Matt Phillips in 2014 at a show curated by Kathy Bradford called The Triumph of Human Painting, which was hosted at a now defunct gallery in Bushwick. And back then, as many of you all remember, Bushwick was kind of a cheaper, scrappier alternative to neighboring Williamsburg. And it was also before social media kind of transformed the art world. Artists had a bit more of a DIY attitude towards some of their careers, curating their own shows, writing reviews for blogs, and artists were forming artist-run galleries. And I think Matt fit really squarely into that moment. And it was a very exciting time for painting. His paintings are composed in a manner similar to musical improvisation. I think of Matt's paintings in the way that he does not use sketches or plans for these silica and pigment works. Irregular patterns, playful borders, curvilinear forms set against geometric form, an interest in the carnivalesque, shallow horizons, drop shadows, layers that read like mesh. I think these are a few of the recurring motifs in his show right now at Anna Zorina called Hold Tight Horizon Eyes in Chelsea. So those of you who haven't seen it yet, might be a great opportunity to go and check it out. I think one of the first things we see when we're looking at abstract painting is language, and then how that language corresponds to lived experience. Phillips uses a language of dualities: over, under, repetition, singularity, big, small, opaque, transparent. In some respects, these are the armature behind any painting, and abstraction uses those qualities as content. So I'd like to kind of start off our conversation, Matt, with just a kind of general question about the title of your show and how it might relate to some of the work that you've made. Could we get the slideshow kind of pulled up a little bit? And maybe we'll kind of scroll to some of the work, just those initial works there in the gallery, and then we'll scroll back eventually to some earlier ones. My first question was, the title of this show makes me think of the city, and we rarely get to see the horizon in New York, and I think when we do, it's pretty romantic. And I thought, well, is the constant construction and deconstruction taking place a source of painterly inspiration? Does the way the city is constantly moving, remaking itself, relate to the way that you make a painting?
Thanks. And also, again, I just want to say thanks to you, Jason, and to the Brooklyn Rail and Anna Zorina and her team, and for everybody for coming on a Monday afternoon. So thanks. That's a great question, and it's funny how questions sometimes help to reveal what you're doing as much as are sort of unintentionally. And I can't say that I'm consciously thinking about mimicking aspects of New York City, but then when I step back and think about it as a process and sort of conceptually, I totally love that question, and I love that idea. And I would say in general, my paintings often start with a grid, and it becomes not so much like it becomes like a point of departure. And I like that when you start with the grid, it denies nature, it denies illusion. It's kind of a way to just sort of like arrive to the literal one-to-one relationship with the picture plane. But then that also kind of becomes a scaffolding that I start to push around, and squares become triangles, and triangles become arcs, and arcs become circles, and sort of through just like a very simple lexicon of shape, I start to get into complicated compositional situations. And I think that's like it's kind of like it's totally like what happens in New York, right? Where like if you walk down the block, we're all sort of arranged on this kind of towering grid, and you have all of these discrete moves through construction and graffiti and ads and fences and nature and weeds and bubblegum, and you have all these things that are sort of happening within that starting point of the grid. And every once in a while, like even now after like 20 years, like it has the capacity to feel like beautiful and poetic and surprising and pictorial. And I like that thing you're talking about also, like when the sun peeks through, because like every once in a while, like all of that activity of man, then like nature sort of finds its way of inserting itself into that. And it just feels like this kind of scale shift. It's like just incredible, right? Like the picture that we're making set against like the experience of nature. So I really like that idea. And yeah, like the grid I know is a very sort of loaded like motif in painting, but I also think in another way it's like one of these like standards and one of these given motifs. And one of the kind of things that kind of runs throughout my project is using the most kind of simple ingredients I can of painting and of like visual language as a way to try to make, something surprising. And I always think of like bread, right? Like if I told you the ingredients of bread, you would just be like, oh, it's just like 4 things. But then you get a loaf of bread and it feels like it's like absolute magic.
Yeah, that makes total sense, and I love the use of the term scaffolding. Not that, I'm trying to kind of read into the paintings as a representational kind of mode, but there are these moments that kind of hint to it. If we could scroll back to a painting that's kind of the outset, I think it's the largest one. Yeah, right there. Um, there's this sense of movement that's taking place alongside the grid. And I think something else that I respond to is like that movement up against it also feeling like a piece of architecture or something that almost feels quite like a still life within it. It both has these capacities to kind of go back and forth between those modes of representation. And I think that's a really wonderful aspect of the way that you think about an abstraction, which kind of leads me to like another question that I've been thinking about, just thinking about like some of the affinities that the work has and the ways in which those have gone across time as sustaining generative interests. There's this interest in poetry and rhythm and music, and I think of artists like William T. Williams, Virginia Jaramillo, Al Held, people who, to varying degrees, employed a certain kind of pop abstraction. There's asymmetry, there's improvisation in the works of some of those artists. And maybe thinking about how your work kind of coming out of that kind of way of thinking or lineage, I thought about how your work is now, especially with a painting like this, is quite large. And for me, I think it might be the largest painting I think I've seen of yours. And I wondered if they now feel more bodily being at a scale like this, if they feel more like real space as opposed to a kind of picture-like space.
I do. I think that the scale has felt important in the show. It feels like one of the things that I was really excited about the show was pushing scale. I think the largest painting I had made in the last few years was probably like 8 feet, and pushing it to, I think this painting is 12 feet across, felt super exciting and also like a little daunting because of the kind of slowness that I deliver the painting. You know, a painting of this size can take quite a while. So, and as we know, like time doesn't equate to quality in painting. Like you can make a great painting in 5 minutes or 5 years. It's kind of when it happens. So, I think there's a few things like, so by pushing scale, I think there's a lot of formal things that happen, right? Like there's a lot of slow development. There's a real kind of deep fascination I have with touching a painting sort of square inch by square inch. And it's funny because I think on one level, there's like what's happening to the painting compositionally and like visually. So yeah, it pushes it more to the realm of architecture, or it pushes it towards the realm of quilts or some of these kind of like familiar sources and references that are happening in the painting. But then there's like also something that's like, I'm kind of equally as interested in like, what just happens when you put an object into a room that's that large, that's just been like touched that much, you know? And so like, I think part of this painting for me, like totally independent of the picture, is like how much tenderness could I put into the world, right? Like just mustering like a gentle touch and sustaining it corner to corner, edge to edge. And in the studio, sometimes like that's driving the work as much as the pictorial decisions. And, you know, this painting has the same, like kind of looping back to your first question, it has the same title as the show itself. And it also kind of talks like this idea of hold tight, horizon eyes. It comes from a quote from a TV on the radio song. And I liked how you were talking about dualities in the work, and this idea of the gesture of holding something tightly, but also like being interested in something so far beyond, like this ambition of looking to the horizon, like on a spiritual level, on a time level, on a space level. And I feel like there's a kind of synergy there to what we do as painters, where we're like always engaged with this like small space between our eyes and our hands, but somehow it's like this incredibly open space that can be like full with mystery and surprise and discovery that we don't seem to be able to exhaust, you know? And
Yeah, it's endless.
I think the other thing is like holding tight, hold tight horizon eyes. It becomes about like patience, and it becomes about being present. And I think like it becomes about hope.
Mm.
And I think like the more art I see and the longer I do it, and as I age, like I feel like artists, one of our primary medium, like is the medium of hope and the material of hope. We're kind of out here just like fishing, hoping to get a good bite every once in a while.
Yeah, yeah, and how difficult it is to kind of muster up that in a increasingly kind of difficult world. These last few years have not been easy for a lot of people, and how generous that kind of is. I think that's something that I really respond to in the work. And maybe we can kind of scroll back a little bit to some of the work earlier in the slideshow, just kind of like giving an overview of some of the work leading up to this body of work. This Remain in Light show at the Landing, and so something you said, Matt, makes me think a lot, reflect a lot, quite a bit. You were talking about patience, like the patience in the studio, and then like the speed with which you kind of make the painting, trying to kind of like create this kind of loving, sensitive touch to like each kind of corner of the surface. And it strikes me how how much slowness can be a virtue. You know, a number of critics have talked about slowness. I know John Yao and Stephen Westfall have written about slowness in paintings. And something I think about, especially right now, I've been thinking so much about how we're kind of like in a burnout culture, a culture that's like constantly asking us to do like a million things all at once, and also like have enough relaxation and time for yourself, and not lose your mind. And so I think about the way in which slowness can also in a painting act in a way in which it can be a stopgap against certain kinds of things. Like it could be a stopgap against spectacle, or slowness can be a stopgap against the desire for entertainment, for painting to just kind of be a form of entertainment. Um, and it can kind of require a certain kind of relationship between audience and maker. And I wonder if you might be able to kind of reflect on that a little bit more, like what is your relationship to time in a work? Can you walk us through how you start and finish a work?
Yeah, I mean, I like slowness is important. I wouldn't want to say that I'm like insisting on it, you know. I think that as the world changes, paintings in some ways seem to be just like we're making them slower just by existing right now. And so I think there's like actually a really exciting space that we're creating for painting, like as a default, as like our pace of life gets more fast and more kind of multi-layered. And I think in terms of this idea for myself as I experience it in my own studio, I was listening to this like Jeff Tweedy book recently, and he had this great question where he said, like, when does a house become a home? And he said, when it's lived in. And I think for me, the idea of actually like a painting just being like a structure or a place that we can live in, and that we can bring our body to, and we can bring our emotion to, and we can bring like totally random aspects of ourself as it's changing day to day. That's like actually becomes pictorial content in a picture. And I would never ever like expect someone to know what I was thinking or what my intentions were. Like I don't think paintings can totally like convey information in that succinct of a way or that direct of a way. But I think they can hold and sort of show intention and show presence and show engagement. And it's like everyone is speaking their own foreign language, but you can still feel like their intention to get something across. And I actually don't even think it's specific to abstraction or figuration. Like I was in the Dana Schutz show a few weeks ago, and I was like having such a crazy time trying to even see those paintings. And it just felt like I was sort of in some way like seeing something that it was totally novel and new. And I was like still trying to develop the like capacity to take those paintings in. And it really made sense why people have to like, you know, go back to a show multiple times in order to like absorb the work. So I don't know, like to go more specifically about the process and how the paintings come. Some are fully improvised directly on the canvas. I do sometimes, like more recently, work through ideas through drawings and sketches. They're never like fully resolved, but sometimes because there's so much kind of failing and improvising and changing and erasing and collaging, more and more I found that drawing is just like a really great way to get through some of the kind of process of my work and in a medium that makes more sense. And the drawings are crude and they're never like the end, but sometimes it brings some kind of like notion of a next step forward when I'm going or when I'm working. I feel like I'm kind of meandering a bit, so
No,
I'm
no,
gonna get.
that makes total sense, Matt. I really like the way that you also made this distinction between a house and a home, a painting kind of feeling lived in. Like it presents its own experience. And that's an experience that has relationships to like the intentions that you have or that maybe any painter has, but isn't like the totality of the thing. I think that's such a poetic and open way of thinking about the possibilities for experience. And it makes me think about like another really big aspect of your paintings is the quality of the light in the work. Like there's this light that's kind of like bouncing back off the white of the ground, almost kind of like emanating through this kind of mesh layer, and then hitting the viewer. And I think there's so many different ways of thinking about light. Of course, there's that natural way of like light reflecting onto a landscape or onto a scene. I think there's a number of painters right now who are trying to think about how light might somehow have some relationship to spirituality. For other people, it's just kind of a material thing. And maybe you could talk a little bit about your relationship to light and luminosity.
Yeah, I certainly am like a sucker for a certain kind of light, and it's painters like the frescoes of like Fra Angelico, like Bonnard, Matisse, Rothko. Like I love paintings that are like literally what's happening is that the light is passing through the pigment, reflecting off of the ground, and then they're sort of being lit from behind. And I think, painters have like different strategies of light, right? Like you can put a color beside another color to mimic the way light behaves or appears. But I think like the thicker the paint, the more the picture is like kind of engaged with the material aspects of the substance of paint. And I have found that by thinning them down, they feel like they lend themselves more to something that's in the room, right? Like the actual ambient light. And like I love when like the light changes in the studio and actually like the light in the space changes because it's becoming a part of like the atmosphere.
Mhm.
But it's funny because, and you might kind of think about this in your work as well, because I feel like you're often playing with opacity and thickness and the grid. Like I think our work has always had a natural conversation. But I feel like when I was sort of coming up as a student, um, there was this idea that like rigorous, invested painting was like thick
Mm.
and heavy. And if it was like a de Kooning or an Auerbach or a Guston, all these painters that I worship, but there was this idea that those were like really kind of serious paintings.
Mhm.
And there was a moment though where I was kind of doing really, really thin underpainting with small brushes with the intention of then putting like thick opaque oil on top of them. And I realized that like what was dictating that decision was kind of like that guilt, and that like the voice in my head. And maybe the color was like a little bit more potent or heavy, but I was losing like all of this information about duration and touch and change. And so the paintings actually were like speeding up a lot, and they felt so much less intimate, and they were moving away from the kind of space of like reading a diary to like the space of painting an interior wall.
Mhm.
And
Mhm.
I think in a certain way, this like texture that you see within this language of geometric shape and these kind of nameable shapes, inside of it is this texture of like this kind of organic accumulation of small moments. And
Mhm.
I like that it's kind of like it's like this information about, I don't know, it's like this contradictory information about like time and nature and duration and accumulation within this kind of more flat nameable shape. But
Yeah. No, I love that. I love the reference points for all of that too. Just kind of like looking at these two paintings on this slide and then thinking about the ways in which you're kind of naming this space between like the materiality of a painter like Gustin and de Kooning, and then like the kind of almost immaterial kind of quality that or ethereal kind of atmospheric qualities that a painter like Fra Angelico might have in a painting. And it's like, well, those strike me as like the poles of thinking about like, well, paint is this material substrate on a material surface, and then it's also pointing at immaterial thoughts and feelings that aren't housed somewhere in some physical material way, and like negotiating those things. And just kind of that whole rigor thing. I thought about that a lot too, because there's been a long conversation, I think, between the two of us. But I go back to the way that like a painter like Matisse, especially with like a painting like the Pink Nude, it's like I think there is in that MoMA show, I think there was like 20 some odd studies in preparation for that. You know, he's like really trying to find something, and it's like the painting itself looks so fast and so quick, and like it feels like a afternoon one sitting kind of moment, but it's clear in that show that like, oh, that came out of this whole process of like trying to get the placement and touch and everything kind of like placed right. And I think about that with respect to your work. There's like this desire for placement and and touch, and then also kind of like wanting to improvise around that. It's not like a pure execution, but neither is it about like a kind of um, that somehow the labor needs to be performed for the viewer in order to kind of say, hey, look, I'm making a painting here, kind of thing.
yeah, I'm not like surely I could make these paintings in an afternoon with like a 3-inch brush, you know? And so I'm aware that the decision is kind of like it's an uphill method, but I also I think that against like what seems to be the kind of like entry point of the painting, which are these kind of bold, graphic, almost like inevitable compositions at first. Um, I really like the way those two things start to create this tug of war. And, um, you know, I like this idea that like a painting is a fixed experience, but that maybe each time we come to it, we see it differently, or it shows us something about itself in a different way. And so I think just by like slowing it down and sort of like forcing certain issues with the execution, it also keeps imbuing it with surprise and information. So it's, I think in my process, there's like an interesting thing that happens where there's like major discovery, and then there's like the most nerdy, like minuscule, like inch by inch discovery that I'm really fascinated about. And then there's a point where like the kind of thing that I thought I was heading to, and then the thing I have is there. And then there's this whole other kind of you know, number of sessions that start to be very fast and fluid, and I start to actually work them not sort of in parts, but more like large watercolors with like really big thin glazes. And that kind of speed shift that happens towards the end of the painting is actually what makes or breaks the picture, even though I think when you see them, the longer you look, they sort of start to be about a kind of a slower pace of making.
So you kind of you still build in the opportunity or capacity for the thing to kind of somehow collapse or transform or move in some other direction that was unintended toward the end of the work. Is that how you're kind of approaching it?
Yeah, for sure.
I think that risk is something that we as a art world and a painting world used to talk about a lot more explicitly as like stakes in a painting, that you would somehow be putting something on the line for the success or failure of the work, and that was going to be kind of built into the thing. And somewhere in the last few years, there's been a lot of conversation, just kind of going circling back to a conversation we were having. There's been a lot of emphasis on intention, a lot of emphasis on like the legibility of a work and its content being communicated very effectively. And I like the way in which you've introduced this middle ground between intention and incident or accident or surprise to also kind of commingle, because that feels authentic and like true to like just what the creative process will generate, as opposed to like a kind of fixed execution kind of way of thinking. On a slightly kind of different topic, I've thought about just another kind of parallel way that some painters have been thinking. There's been a number of painters, I'd say, in the last decade or so or more, thinking about technology with respect to painting. There was like that whole movement of like post-internet art. There was like that show, post-analog painting, that I think the Whole put on some years back. A number of painters who've introduced things like spray guns, print techniques, digital imagery. I think of painters like Laura Owens, Wade Guyton, even Rashid Johnson, painters who are just kind of like, I'm exploring a different relationship to the gesture or painterly mark than a more kind of traditional manner. And I wonder what your relationship to technology is. Is it something you think about at all? Does it matter? Um, is it important that we have some relationship to the touch at this moment that you feel like you're trying to advocate for?
Yeah, I mean, I love those painters, and I think their work is really kind of important in pushing the kind of edge of painting. Um, for my own practice, like it's funny, like I mean, first of all, like because of like things like Instagram and our phone, like we're always allowed to touch a picture, right? That's actually how we sort of navigate the world now, is through touching pictures and swiping on pictures and tapping on pictures. And like when I'm not on Instagram for like 12 hours of the day, I'm in my studio tapping on these pictures with like a brush, right? So it's kind of actually very contemporary in one way, like in an embarrassing way. Um, but I also think like it's funny because I know I talked about it a little bit, but like I'm very interested on a sort of lexicon, like a visual lexicon level of using these things that are like highly nameable, and like basically the things that you're learning in like intro painting or even in elementary school are the things that I'm using, like nameable shapes, value gradients, like really simple stuff. And I like the idea that if you're using these simple ingredients, but then they do something really surprising, it kind of like lets you into the magic of what paintings can do.
Mhm.
And I think over time, like this small, simple touch, like in a way, um, what I'm interested in about it is it feels like kind of like this authorless way of touching a painting.
Mm.
Like it doesn't reference any painter. It kind of references any painting. Whereas if you like use a squeegee, or if you splash, it's Richter or Pollock, or if you drip, it's Pat Steer, or if you hook at the end, it's de Kooning. Like, so in a certain way, I feel like it's kind of like a non-issue. But then I've like adhered to it so much of being like, I'm just gonna dip this brush into the paint, and I'm just gonna put down as much as that's held on the brush, and I'm gonna do it again. And each time those things touch, it's gonna create this pattern that I'm not fully kind of consciously deciding what it's doing, right? Sometimes I am, sometimes I'm not. But I think just by like sticking to it and being so kind of stubborn about it, it's like amplifying or voicing something that's part of all painting.
Mhm.
And I think something that's been exciting to me is that when I started doing this, the conversations that I was having about my own paintings, like people talk to me about the way that like moss grows and
Mm.
patterns of rocks and geology and water rippling or quilts and folding or paper crumpling. And it's so often that those kinds of associations that people like bring to the material aspect of the painting have nothing to do with painting. And so it's like a nice way to, I think, get people into this receptive space that like, yeah, it's a picture, but it's aspiring actually to be about the world, despite it being like a formal exercise, right? And it's another way of encouraging that slip between the nameable and something else that, you know, it's said almost despite you. Or with,
Sorry, go ahead.
or just like with your aid or with your um company and while you're in its company.
Yeah. Yeah, I love that. Well, I think in part it kind of sounds like a desire for ego to kind of be slightly put on the back burner when it comes to what touch is in the painting. That it's like it's about you. Obviously, you're the maker and you're the one devising the entire painting. But then it's also kind of about this kind of sense of humanity that perhaps anybody might have some relationship or similar relationship to that touch or similar relationship to like that kind of feeling that might arise out of the thing, which seems to me like a really wonderful ascendant wing of abstraction in the late 20th century that the late Bryce Martin really kind of embodied in this way, this kind of sense that like this was somehow bigger than himself, and that he's kind of just maybe a conduit for something, transmitting something, but like it's not really about that kind of gesture in the way that that heroic gesture from first, second, third wave of AbX, or a declarative kind of me. It's about me as painter, as author. There's a kind of like relationship that I think is formed there for you and for other painters that I think seems to kind of be this open space. Even just kind of looking at these two paintings on the screen right here, I think about the way in which there's moments which they almost kind of feel breathed on as pigment or as image or as surface. There's like it's almost slipping away entirely, and then it kind of snaps back into a sense of its pictureness again, and there's a graphic dimension. And I think that speaks to the ways in which you're kind of speaking about the paintings. Something like moss or something natural just kind of forming, arising, having a relationship to it, backing off when you feel like it's done its job.
That's awesome. Yeah, I mean, I also just like as a to dovetail or piggyback on that, like I feel like there was that 3-year period where everyone's favorite painting was a quilt from Alabama, like when the G's Bend show arrived to New York, was like 2004. Oh man, are you guys still there?
Yeah.
Okay, sorry, I've somehow gotten kicked off. I can't see you. Okay. So I think, yeah, like the way that those quilts just like totally opened up people's ideas of what a painting could be, was like, or at least for me, it like was such an exciting moment. And then I think, yeah, like that kind of fragility and tenuousness, or this like idea that they could almost be swept away or like blow away, like it's happening on that material level. I also think if you're looking at the paintings, it's a little hard to see them like in installs, but a lot of times the paintings, they appear to be like symmetrical and stable, and they have this kind of quick graphic like presentation. But the longer we look at them, they start to be kind of broken and disjointed, and things don't fully line up. And as I'm working through like the different stages and collaging and drawing and painting, like all these different moments, they really do like line up perfectly. And I think like just as I want the material to push this idea of a kind of fluid read, I think if things are kind of like a little askew, the longer you look, the more you realize that maybe these are like very fragile moments that could like tumble and like kind of fall apart. Or maybe they've just finally achieved stability. And I like that paintings have this power to, they happen so slowly, but like a great painting for me, like when it pinpoints a moment in time, like when you're looking at a Vermeer and you're like, I know exactly what happened before this moment in the painting, and I have a pretty good sense of where it's going, but it's just this moment, and it's like pinned down with like a needle, it's just insane.
Yeah.
And I love, I think I think one of the things that I'm interested in is like if the situation doesn't feel stable, maybe it's like another way of getting the viewer to like lend their body or like empathize with the situation to like try to chip in and help.
That makes total sense. Yeah, the way in which like we're in this moment that's incredibly precarious too. And I think that's found its way into our consciousness in ways that are explicit and implicit. Like, we're living in the midst of a total environmental disaster, um, a huge loss of faith in institutions, a sense of maybe where democracy stands in the global situation. A lot of things feel in flux, and we as humans are kind of all maybe scratching our heads about how and when and what we are to do about them. And I think as a painter, that sense of precarity, that sense of um, the painting kind of maybe resting on something that feels like it's on the verge of possible collapse or possible tenuousness, that it's like in that space. I think like you said, activates a kind of bodily response to the work, activates a kind of haptic response to the thing, that tells us something about you as a maker, which kind of leads me to like another question I was thinking about. In an interview you did with Yevgenia some years back, you were talking about, she asked a question that I'm going to paraphrase. It was largely that, do you ever see about introducing representational elements into the work? And I think your response, to that question was something to the effect of, I tend to think of the images as figures. And so, I'm curious if you think of maybe the painting as kind of a way of talking about the self from a distance, but maybe not in the way that a straight up representational painter might think of the self or a subject.
Mhm. Yeah, I have to add one more thing to your first or your last question about the kind of fragility. I just want to I love what you were saying there and the kind of charged moment that we're living in, and the collapsing of institutions and the state of the environment and the state of politics in the whole entire world right now. I would never assign like any grand meaning to my paintings beyond they're just what they are. But one of the things that I'm interested in trying to push in my pictures is that there are many contradictory things happening at the same time.
Mm-hmm.
And they start with nothing, but they hopefully maybe evoke nature, or they evoke growth, or they evoke standing by the sea, or they evoke a rib cage expanding and contrasting, right? And so there's a way that they are they have seeds of nothingness, but they're hopefully aspiring to be human and poetic, and they are flat and they are, singular graphic things, but also they tremble and they wobble and they're touched by the hand, and nothing is actually straight, and they're sort of as asymmetrical as our own bodies are the longer we look at them. And so paintings are like a quiet, they're an argument with themselves, but they're silent. And I feel like our world right now is like an argument it's like aired out so publicly, right? It's like you sort of can't escape. You can't escape the argument, and so maybe in a certain way, paintings are like opening up the possibility for us to tolerate contradiction,
Mm,
and
I love that.
that you can have care in contradiction, and you can have uh, patience in contradiction, and that you can have acceptance and like a productive contradiction, right? And I
Mhm.
think we all love great art because it's doing something despite its limitations, right?
Yeah.
And so,
Mm.
which I think also kind of coming back to this, your next question about figuration and uh, representation, like I never have those arguments until I start talking about it, right? But when you're standing in front of a Cezanne or you're standing in front of you know, Joan Mitchell, like I think so often what's amazing about those things is that we get to kind of have that direct experience with them existing outside of those categories. And these paintings are fully about my life. They're fully about things that I'm thinking about. They're about, watching a flower bloom with like planting a garden with my 6-year-old son and talking about how flowers convert the energy of the sun into a blossom that uh, feeds a bee that we then eat the pollen. Or it's about being on a lighthouse and looking out and imagining following a kind of beam of light from a horizon back to the land. It's about all of these different things that I'm thinking about, again, that I don't think anyone would know, but they're things that I sort of carry in myself. And I think how they live initially as sort of these abstract, slightly less nameable um, images, I hope that they start to, whisper something beyond what they originally sort of showed themselves to be.
Right. Yeah, well, and I think your titles allude to as much. Here you have gleaners, and I think in a painting we were looking at before, it was titled Bramble. Like they're evocative and suggestive of a certain kind of space or atmosphere. I think something too that you're kind of talking about that I think about quite a bit too is how just going back to that whole state of the world thing. Some artists think, my painting's going, or this sculpture or this video is going to somehow address the Anthropocene or the patriarchy or gun violence. And, more power to them. I'm skeptical sometimes of the capacity for art to be able to kind of transform in that way. But I do think what is not negligible is like the psychic transformation. And I don't mean like a astrology or tarot card psychic. I mean like psychic, the psychological, emotional, and philosophical sense that we all carry within us can be slightly transformed in front of that experience. And it's unnameable, it's not quantifiable, really. It's something that's deeply personal and it's felt and it's understood and sensed. And that's like a necessary thing in the world. I think that's an incredibly important thing in the world and something that we like lost sight of as a function that art actually gives, as a gift. It's like a gift exchange between audience and maker that's involved, that there's a quality involved there. And we can choose to kind of lean into it or not. It's up to us. And I think you're clearly doing a job of kind of leaning in.
Yeah, and like as an abstract painter, I feel like my quote unquote abstractions, like they gain strength from representational association. And I think representational paintings gain strength from quote unquote abstraction, right? And I think that they rely on each other. And um, I think that's like, yeah, I just totally agree. And I don't know that a painting has ever sort of laid out for me personally, like a way to think. But they have definitely encouraged ways of being and ways of being in the world.
Mhm.
And it's very funny because like this painting right here, I'm looking at it and like, at some point everyone was just calling it like the chopstick and noodle painting. And I was like, wow, that's so funny. Like I totally see that. And I'm totally cool with that. I love chopsticks and noodles and like no problem there. Um, but it's not at all what I was thinking about, right? And I was thinking about it as like this rib cage, and I was thinking about it as this kind of void, or this kind of I don't know, like kind of enveloping this space of like a torso. And this whole moment of like bringing those two linear forms together at the bottom, and this kind of just the tenderest gesture and the most intimate space that I could try to put inside of this huge kind of empty breathing void. And I was thinking about, a heartbeat, and I was thinking about air, and I was thinking about the way feelings enter the body. And someone else was thinking about spaghetti and meatballs. And I just think that's awesome. Like,
Yeah.
works for me. Like, great spaghetti and meatballs. Like, I can feel that way too.
Yeah, you allow that kind of open-endedness, it seems like, into the reading of the work. Yeah. Hmm. Yeah, I think too about how that same desire for that is kind of a desire for a less literal relationship to language. Sometimes there's a lot, I mean, everybody's probably seen a ton of press releases in the last 5, 6 years that are kind of like basically just kind of spelling out for you what the work is about, what it's trying to address as an issue, and then it's like ultimate meaning. It's like, wow, like, do I even need to see the show? Like, you've told me everything about the experience that I'm already going to have, which is a visual and bodily experience. And you're kind of privileging that. You're kind of saying, you know what, I'm actually interested in you being there and having maybe an experience that varies. Maybe it goes all the way from spaghetti and meatballs, noodles, to talking about the quality of the air in the room, and you want the audience to be able to have all of that. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, uh, I feel like paintings get brought across the finish line when viewed by someone else.
Mhm.
And the artist never gets to push the painting all the way across the finish line. It's in the act of going up to the edge, but someone else pulling it over, that it gets to go home.
Right.
So, and I think in my painting, where I'm also like so intimately involved with every square inch and touching it so slowly, it's also like, it's about being like way too in control and like way too on top of a surface, right? And sort of like, for me, there's something kind of great about, at least by giving it away, maybe I can redeem that like tendency of myself.
Mhm.
Say, okay, now it's yours and it's up to you.
Yeah.
And I'm letting go of this thing. It's time for it to, to go.
Well,
So
I go ahead, Matt.
I think, that's maybe it's more of a comfortable conversation when it's in the realm of abstraction, maybe, perhaps, and when it applies to um, paintings that are more kind of, they're showing their values more kind of directly. But I still think the same exact processes are at play. And so maybe like some of that frustration with the press release is that it's actually limiting what a painting can do. It's like it kind of casts like a really big shadow onto the work itself.
Yeah. Yeah, and that there's faith. Perhaps just kind of circling back around. I know we're kind of starting to run out of time here, but I think circling back around to something you were talking about before, like as you're aging, this desire for like belief in painting and wanting that experience to be something that's like meaningful for you and for the audience. And that there's like this desire for that in the work and the desire for your audience to also have that, which is like, again, this kind of generosity toward the audience about saying your experience is something that I'm also allowing to have a relationship to. The completion of this work is you being there and being able to have that relationship. um yeah. Well, perhaps that's a good time to unless you had something else, Matt, perhaps it's a good time to turn it back over to Chloe for some Q&A.
Thank you so much, Matt and Jason, for that dialogue. That was so generous, and it was really lovely to hear more about the show, Matt.
Thanks.
We have several questions, and if you have a question that you would like to ask Matt, please feel free to post it in the chat or raise your hand, and I will turn to you. The first question is going to be from our friend GE. GE, I'll give you the chance to unmute. It's good to see you.
Thank you very much, Chloe. Thank you, Jason, and thank you, Matt. Excuse me. Looking at the structures that they seem to have, and also the fact that you alluded to Frangelica, and I was thinking also of Giotto, the various structures that are in those paintings sometimes that it seem to have a deep kinship between the way those kind of structures are and having a sort of sense of both grace and devotion to the way they're executed and the way they're coming, way I'm picking up on them. Is there anything to this at all? Do you have any?
Absolutely, and maybe I got a little bogged down in some of the process and not as much of the sort of specifics of any one work, but I can think of a few even in the current show, like that blue painting. It was maybe the last slide we looked at, and it has this kind of spiraling gesture there on the left. You can just stay on that slide right there. And I had actually got to go to Rome last year, and after seeing like the ceiling paintings, the Pozzo, I think was the name of the artist, with this like incredible spiraling angels in the sky, right? And like, again, I don't think anyone would ever know that, or like Tiepolo, but I think just that kind of gesture, that structure, those bones, they're like a motif of painting. And so kind of like the 4-bar blues. And I think that gesture is something that has been used over and over in painting. Or the one to the right of it, the red painting. I remember I had this great painting teacher, Gideon Bach, and we looked at Annunciation paintings. And in an Annunciation painting, you have the simple structure of usually like the right hand where Mary is and the left hand where the garden is, and then the architecture, which makes this grid. And then the one thing you have is Angel Gabriel with the diagonal line, right? And that one diagonal breaks the stability of the structure of the grid, and it combines heaven with earth and spirit and flesh. And again, I don't think anyone would think about that. But for me, when I think about that as a kind of standard, this picture is about this kind of diagonal within the grid that sets up the ability to make a stairway. So it's a stairway to heaven, or, like not really, but it kind of has that, those bones, or that it's riffing on these forms through our history. And I like that they're there for everyone. And I think, the more kind of we can see that like as another tool to engage, I always find it really exciting. I also, a lot of this I sort of impose on the paintings after I make them. I don't even know why at the time, but it feels true. that red painting, I also remember, like, I've always placed red paintings sort of out of bounds because it just felt like it was too of this kind of like cliche of like drama and emotion. But I had this former teacher, Richard Ryan, a really great painter, and he talked about making a series of paintings that was the color when you close your eyes and look at the sun. And I always loved that idea of like that red of the sunlight passing through the lens and seeing the blood in your body. And I think I finally sort of was going to try to like take that on as a color idea in this picture.
That's so very true. Thank you so very much.
Thank you so much for that question, GE. That's a good segue to our next question, which is from Nate Harris. Nate, I'm going to give you the chance to unmute to ask.
Hi, Matt. I just wanted to ask about your choice of medium. It says pigment and silica, and I was just wondering like how you discovered that medium and what it does to kind of contribute to that feeling of like softness that you get from your from the pieces, and like it feels very delicate. And I was luckily able to see the show in person, and it is very delicate up close. And yeah, just wanted to hear about that medium versus an acrylic or an oil, or thanks.
Yeah, I always sort of associated acrylic paint with like the toys that I played with in the 80s. And it sort of never had a certain kind of like softness about it. And I came through as an oil painter, so it never kind of behaved in the way that I wanted it to. And then I was commuting to teach in Western Massachusetts, and I learned about Gara pigments at the same time. And I started making paintings that I could put in the back of my car that would be dry, and I could take the paintings back and forth and keep working on them. And so Gara just ended up just on a whim being something I was playing with one day. And again, kind of like some of this conversation we've been having, I found that it was actually voicing something that I was already doing in oil painting, but it was kind of showing it better, where I was touching these surfaces a lot with small brushes, and I was really interested in kind of, imbuing them with my hand and my body. But as you're working sort of oil paint into oil paint, it just all became one passage. But with this stuff, because it sets and dries faster, it was creating this, other, level of information. And then it also, with the conversation around, luminosity, with the Gara paints, which is what I primarily use, you can basically turn anything into a transparent pigment. So I liked that no matter what I was doing, I wasn't kind of stuck to the kind of material aspects and the quality of the light that was coming from the tube. It's also like a very clumsy paint, and it's actually a very limiting paint in many ways also, because it's like a commercial pigments often, and on a molecular level, the molecules are like really big compared to oil paint, which is really, really small. So you can't get like kind of complex tertiary color with acrylics in the way that you can with oil. And so it's been a funny thing where I kind of love certain aspects of it, and then I really fight other aspects of it. And it often, I feel like it kind of can sometimes limit what I want the color to do, but it's like freeing what I want the light and the actual kind of material to do. So it's a funny dance.
Thank you so much for that question, Nate. That was great to hear more about. The next question is going to be from Pamela. Pamela, I'll give you the chance to unmute to ask.
Hi, thank you so much for taking my question. And thank you, Matt, for very inspiring work. And as I have listened to you speak, I've been very interested in edges in my own work. And when I find another artist who uses edges in geometric abstraction like you do, both within the composition, but as well as how edges operate on the outside edges. Because I've noticed in several of your pieces that there is a fracturing or an unevenness or the breaking of the straight edgeness of it that I find very interesting. And I'd like you to kind of talk about what is your thought process about the forms that you create and the space in which those forms operate, and how are edges defining for you in the composition, if that makes any sense.
Yeah, I'm like an edge fanatic. I think that edges are like they're like the second hand of a clock. And I love in painting watching things touch, touch, touch. And to me, that's how it kind of moves you through the read of the painting, but it also moves you through decision, decision, decision. And I love that kind of echo that happens where in the looking, we're also watching the making, right? And so bringing two decisions together in a painting is like, it's just, it never ceases to just feel like total magic. I think there's also a way that a felt edge feels very different than like a ruled edge. I know that's really like obvious to say, but just like the experience of somebody delivering something by hand, it feels like there's the superficial thing they're describing, and then there's the thing that they're describing that then starts to describe something about that person. And the edge is often a great place to witness the maker. And then you'll notice in the paintings, if we like zoom out, the paintings themselves are in these like perfect rectangles, but they rarely actually touch the outside of the canvas. So they have like a white border. And that, to me, I think that started watching like or seeing those G's Benz quilts and seeing the way they were like pinned to the wall and how each one had like a picture, but then each one also had its own pose and gesture. And it felt like you were looking at a picture, but then the picture was showing you something about gravity. And the materials were telling you a story about someone working in a field and someone's, bed sheets and a baby's blanket. And it was telling you all these stories, and all that had a physical weight that then gave it a shape on the wall. And I think as I'm working within the rectangle, sometimes like one or two edges will touch. Occasionally they'll go off, but more often than not, it feels like each one has its own kind of special way of occupying the room. In the same way that like when I'm looking in at the grid, like everybody has a slightly different way of filling the rectangle in front of us, right? And I like that, coming back to that question about figuration versus abstraction, like for me, the first figure in my painting is just that funny little shape inside of the rectangle. And that's the first thing you get. And then inside of that, it maybe has second and third and fourth relationships that start to unfold.
Yeah, there seems to be a formal hierarchy that happens in your work that you've just explained. What's interesting to me also is the transitional moment of the edge of those geometric forms within the composition transitioning to space. And
Mm.
of course, you know, in a drawing, when you're, let's say you're teaching drawing of a figure and you're trying to explain to students that there's a transition of the edge of the arm to the space around the form, the body. You know, what happens there? How do we define it? How do we think about it? Is it a line, or is it more transitional? Is there a transformation that's taking place in not only the material, but in our understanding of that moment? And so the edge is pregnant with all that possibility. And, you know, your work, because you use color in the way you do, and space and form in this kind of geometric abstractive way, it seems to pronounce these kind of transitions in a very pregnant way. It feels alive to me. Like you're very much paying attention to that transitional, I don't know, existential moment, you know, and even how you describe the haptic way in which you work, you know, it's all about bringing that to the surface in the immediacy of that experience. So anyway, I thank you. It's lovely work. Thank you.
Sure.
Thank you so much, Pamela, for that question and for those observations. We have another question from EJ Hauser, which I'm going to read on EJ's behalf because EJ is currently on a ladder painting. Matt and Jason, what music are you painting to right now? Thank you for this great conversation. Also, if anyone else has a question, this is the last call. Feel free to post it in the chat and I'll give you a chance to ask.
Jason, you go first.
Oh, that's so mean.
Recommendations.
Um, well, I just actually went to a kind of minimal ambient, minimal classical show with Kadar Brock on Friday night, and I have to say I listened to quite a bit of that, like Brian Eno and Laraji and Harold Budd, and yeah, really minimal compositions feature heavily in the studio. Other things happen outside of the studio, but that's the studio mix.
Amazing. Geez, it's very varied right now. I actually have had like my first kind of deepest dive into like podcasts and like books on tape. So I just listened to a book on tape, Grocery Store of, what's it called? Grocery Store of Heaven and Earth. James McBride. It's a beautiful book. I really enjoy just finished the season of a podcast called Dissect, which is a long form analysis of records, and they just did Radiohead's In Rainbows. And I had kind of slept on that album, and it really was like an incredible listen. To add to the ambient techno stuff, I've been listening to Nils Fromm when I like the kind of quieter music. And then like any hip hop from 1994 is hip hop that I want to listen to.
Thank you both so much. And thank you everyone in the audience today for your questions. That was such a great Q&A. Thank you so much, Jason and Matt, for today's conversation. And thanks, Matt, for giving us all those amazing images to look at of your shows. And we'd also like to thank the Terra Foundation for American Art, who sponsor our NSE program and make daily conversations like this one possible. They also support our growing archive, which you can view on the Rails YouTube channel. The Rail has been free and independent for 23 years. A donation to our work will directly support our writers, production staff, and operations for the coming year. You can check the chat for a link to donate to the Rail. And if you're free tomorrow at 1 p.m., join us for a conversation on Zoom with artist Aki Sasamoto and writer Cassie Packard on the occasion of Sasamoto's exhibition at the Queens Museum Point Reflection. And as is tradition, you all can now turn on your microphones and say hello and goodbye as you leave. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you, Matt. Thank
Thank
you.
you.
Thanks,
you.
Matt.
Thanks,
Thanks,
everybody.
Jason.
Thank you.
Bye,
Thank you,
everyone.
Matt. Thank you,
Thank you.
Jason.
Bye.
Wonderful.
Thank you,
Thanks,
Jason.
Matt. Thanks, Jason.
Thanks, Matt.
Matt and Jason, you were great.
Hey, thanks.
All right, everybody. Thank you so much, Matt and
Thank
Jason.
you.
Bye.
Thank you.
Guys.